Welcome to our Big Toes, Bunions, and Beyond mini workshop today, deep movement deep dive session. I was just saying this before we started recording, but you're going to need today all of the things. You're going to need some socks, some towels, whatever you have on hand. I would say at least have 3 different things, or 3 of the same things, or if you have the wedges. I've been experimenting with doing this work without wedges and using socks and towels instead because I find that I still get good benefits. There's no actual need to buy into the branded anatomy and motion wedges. Maybe I shouldn't say that because I definitely support Gary and anatomy and motion and his work, but I don't think you really need these. I think you can use towels and socks. It works just as well. So definitely going to need something today. I was also saying we're going to need a book. Something like yay thick. It's about, I don't know, a few inches, something like that, something that is the length of your foot. We're going to stand on it. And I was just saying that one of my mentors says that we shouldn't stand on books. And I was just musing about why that might be, something to do with respecting learning, respecting education, what the book stands for. So we're going to take that into consideration, take it to heart, and we're going to stand on our books anyway and stand on them lovingly and respectfully. And that's, I think, it that you'll need for tools today. Today's going to be a little bit of an experiment for me because I just got this foot model, which we're going to use to conceptualize the movement of the big toe and how it relates with the rest of the foot and the mechanics that we talked about in the workshop. So when we were discussing pronation and supination in the workshop, we didn't really talk about specific parts of the foot. We talked really generally about the foot shape, that the arch lowers, where the weight goes in the foot, and things that were more feely. We didn't really talk about anything specific and sort of conceptual joint-wise. So today our lesson portion, our conceptual portion, is going to be maybe just a little bit more in depth. Don't worry if it doesn't make sense the first time you go through this. I'm going to do my best to demonstrate and explain the movement of the big toe as it relates to pronation and supination. I'm going to do my best to do that in very simple terms that anyone can understand, but still respects the complexity of this structure. So our intention today is to understand what the big toe does in the context of gait when our foot is pronating and supinating. And we're going to look at some self-assessments to see what our big toes can do. Does our big toe have access to the joint motions available at it? And then do those joint motions happen at the appropriate time in the right relationships with the structures around it? And even the structures above it. So even going up into the skull, we're going to be looking at how the big toe and the foot relate to skull movement. It's always really fun to relate the movements down below the foot up to stuff above to see if there's any connections there, see if there's a root cause of why my neck is sore, with maybe there's a movement limitation in the foot, or vice versa, top down, bottom up. I don't know. Don't know if we can really know the truth, but we can investigate it and see if there's any sort of correlation there. Just did a movement session online yesterday with one of my Liberated Body students to do a one-on-one troubleshoot, and we found that in her right foot, she was not really pronating her foot very well, and she also had a hard time getting this upper part of her neck to open up into this lateral flexion, and there was definitely a correlation there, so that was kind of cool, the foot to neck thing. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. And we're going to look at bunions, and a lot of people have questions about bunions and what you can do about them, why they happen. We're going to look at that from a movement perspective. I'm not going to make any conclusions about what's going to happen with your bunions today or whether we can change bunions. No conclusions, just exploring from a movement perspective how they show up in gait, because the mechanic of a bunion actually shows up when the foot pronates. And so it's not a bad thing. It just gets it gets away from us a little bit, and we have to rein that big toe in so it doesn't just do this clever structural adaptation we call a bunion. I think that's it. That's all I need to say before we get started. I'm just referencing my notes because I have a lot of things to say today. Obviously, our movement exploration is going to be all around helping us to feel if our big toes can move in all the motions that are available to it. So let's start with, what does the big toe do? We're going to look at this just in 2 planes of motion today, because otherwise we'll be here for hours, and I want to make this as concise and simple as possible. So what we mean by the big toe, we're looking at my lovely foot model here, it's this guy here. So here we have the first ray, the first metatarsal, and when we're talking about the tripod, it's the base of the first metatarsal here, that's the first metatarsal head. So the first ray and the joint here, between the first metatarsal and the big toe, the first metatarsal phalangeal joint, we'll just call it the big toe joint. This is what we're looking at. There is a joint here that allows for movement. So the toe, when it lifts up like this, that's called extension or dorsiflexion. And then when the toe goes down like that, that's called plantar flexion. And what I think is really important for us to consider first is that there is a difference between how these motions of extension and plantar flexion, there's a difference between how those look when the foot's on the ground versus when the foot's off the ground, swinging through the air. When the foot's on the ground, we call that a closed chain situation, because the joints, the surface of the foot is on something, versus open chain where it's freely in the air. So when the foot is freely moving through the air, basically, all these joints and bones of the foot, they act as kind of one unit. They're just going to hold the foot shape that you have by structural default. When the foot's swinging through the air, we don't really have articulations in the foot like we would when the foot's on the ground, because the ground is there for something to articulate with. So the motions that the big toe can do look quite different with the foot on the ground, and we want to get clear about what that is. Another thing to consider is that for most of the gait cycle, the foot is on the ground. And when the foot's swinging through the air, that's only a moment in time. Most of the time, the foot's on the ground, articulating into pronation and supination. So we're going to look at that closed chain, pronation, supination. What does big toe motion actually look like? Because it doesn't look like much. And the reason why it doesn't look like much is because the big toe needs to stay on the ground. We're not elves. We don't walk around with our big toes up off the ground, kind of pointed upwards, like elf boots. So the reason why we need the big toe on the ground, there's muscles that run under the big toe that are very important for different phases of the gait cycle, that we need the big toe to be on the ground to articulate well, so those muscles get the stimulation. It's also kind of from a safety neurological perspective. If there's a part of your foot that isn't on the ground, you're not going to feel as grounded. There's not as much surface contact. So for safety and for appropriate function of the muscles, we need to have the big toe on the ground. That doesn't mean we need to grip the ground with the big toe, but it needs to be able to be on the ground and not be lifting up or pressing into it super hard. So that's just some foundation ideas that we're going to work with. Now let's look at what the big toe does when the foot pronates. And we're going to start with the side view. Remember, side view is sagittal plane. So let's look at this first metatarsal. And can you see, just to begin with, how this end closest to the ankle is higher than this end closest to the toe? So there's this downward slope. When the foot pronates, we know the foot flattens, the arch flattens. So see what happens with the first ray. Can you see how it flattens to become parallel to the floor? So we have this end higher, and then as the foot pronates, that end closest to the ankle goes lower, and this end that was closest to the toe must come up to the ceiling as a result to lay flat. Now, what happens if there wasn't a joint here? Well, the whole thing would just come up off the floor, right? If there was no joint here and this was one long bone, we would just see the big toe coming up off the floor. I hope that makes a little bit of sense conceptually. But we know we don't want to have the big toe floating off the floor. It needs to stay down in contact, grounded. So what happens instead is, instead of the big toe floating off the floor, it needs to lower back down just to stay on the floor, to stay in contact. So when the foot's pronating and we have this nice first metatarsal bone going down at the end closest to the ankle and up at the end closest to the toe. In order for the big toe not to also go up to the ceiling, it needs to stay down, which means what's actually happening, if you took the floor away, is this. Let me see if I can show that better. That. So if there was no floor there and you're just off the edge, we'd have that happening as the foot pronates. The toe would go down. So as a rule, when the foot's pronating, I hope that was clear. When the foot's pronating, the big toe joint is going to plantar flex down. So it goes the opposite direction of the first metatarsal. So this idea of opposition that we looked at through the pelvis, ribcage, and skull, that cog concept, it actually happens a little bit here for the foot. The big toe goes the opposite way of the first metatarsal, so it can stay on the ground. And then we have that articulation there through the joint. It's not big, but it does happen. Now, if it's not happening, then maybe your big toe is going to lift up, or maybe you're doing an excessive amount of gripping into the toe, which is blocking the ability for the foot to actually pronate. If you're digging into the toe there, you're not going to be able to move down with the arch the way you'd like to. Now let's look at supination. It's the opposite. So what does a big toe extension look like? It looks like this. In a supination, the big toe is extending like this, but just to the extent that it stays on the ground. So what that looks like is, let's say you're pronated. So this bone, the first ray, is lying flat. As the foot supinates, we are going to see this end closest to the ankle move back up, and this end closest to the big toe moving down. So we have that ski slope again. Now, what if there was no joint here? What if there was nothing allowing this articulation between the big toe and the first ray, and it was just one bone? What would happen is, if you continued that motion, you would get this situation where there's now space between the bottom of that first ray, and you're basically just on the tip of your big toe. We know that doesn't happen because there's a joint here. So what actually happens is, when this bone comes back up into that ski slope, for the big toe to not point like this, like a ballet foot, it actually needs to lift up slightly. I'm breaking the toe now. It needs to kind of point up slightly into dorsiflexion, but only to the extent that it stays on the floor. So it's doing dorsiflexion or extension by virtue of this sort of motion instead of this sort of motion. So let me just review that again, because that might be a little conceptual and new. So when this bone flattens out in a pronation, if there was no joint here, what would continue to happen is the big toe would lift up off the floor, just to exaggerate that. But that doesn't happen because the big toe needs to stay down. So in order for the big toe to stay down, it has to actually move down into the floor. Just a little bit. The big toe plantar flexes down into the floor so that it can stay on the ground, but it slides forwards. It doesn't squish down super hard. It just stays on the floor and slides forwards. The opposite is true for a supination. This end of the first ray comes up to create the arch that we know we need in supination. There's a joint here which allows the big toe to go in the opposite direction. So as this first ray is making the ski slope shape, the big toe doesn't continue into the ski slope shape. It has to dorsiflex a little bit to stay on the ground. Okay. So that was our sagittal plane. Let's look at what a bunion looks like, which is actually looking at the transverse plane, so the rotation. Remember, transverse plane is if you looked at the foot from above. A bunion is this sort of deviation of the big toe kind of opening up there on the inside like that. So where does that happen? Does that happen when the foot pronates or supinates? Because every motion the foot can do happens at a particular moment in time. So what we want to consider again is that idea of opposition in the foot. When the foot pronates, there is this internal rotation of the ankle. So this is the left foot, and if I twist the ankle inwards, that's an internal rotation. And when the foot rotates inwards, or the ankle rotates inwards rather, we know that happens with a pronated foot or pronating foot. The ankle internally rotates, twists this way. So what if there were no joint articulations in the foot and it was just one big structure? You'd have this. The whole foot would swivel. We know that doesn't happen. By virtue of all these articulations in the middle of the foot, when the ankle rotates inwards, we actually have this situation where there's this kind of external rotation through the rest of the foot. So to exaggerate, it twists like that. And that's where we have the muscles on the inside of the foot getting a nice stretch out opportunity with pronation. The big toe is part of that motion of going out. And that's where we see a bunion showing up in gait as a normal thing. What can become problematic is when we adopt that as a part of our static structure because of years of doing that. So why does that happen? So consider if your foot or your ankle is already internally rotated all the way, and your foot's already pronated all the way, and you're kind of stuck there all the time. So with each footstep you take, you're not really pronating because you're already pronated. Reorganize this guy. So what would have to happen? The foot needs to still feel like it's doing something. So for a lot of people, when they're stuck pronated already, the big toe does more of that. We get this deviation of the big toe as a last-ditch attempt to do some kind of pronation mechanics in the foot. So in the anatomy and motion course, what Gary has taught us is that when you see a foot that does have a bunion, you want to question, can that foot pronate? Is that bunion an adaptation of a foot that can't really pronate well? And could teaching the rest of the foot to pronate help this guy, the big toe, to not need to do that buiniony strategy as a movement? And then perhaps get stuck there as a useful structural adaptation. Useful, but not necessarily a good long-term solution. And so if that's what happens when the foot pronates, supination must be the opposite. In supination, we know the ankle externally rotates, so it twists out towards the pinky toe side. If there were no joint articulations in the rest of the foot, when you turn your ankle out, the whole foot would come with it. When the foot's on the ground, the foot can articulate. And so instead of the whole foot rotating with it, we have the ankle rotating out and then this lovely sort of wavy motion of the whole front of the foot going that way. That's why it's important to keep these points of contact on the front of the foot, because otherwise your foot just moves as one chunk instead of allowing that beautiful articulation of the bones. And so you can see how when the foot supinates, the ankle externally rotates. We actually have the motion of the big toe that's the opposite of the buiniony position. And so when you're looking at a foot that has a bit of a bunion, you're looking at, can it pronate? And also, can it supinate? It probably has challenges with both. And so both are going to be a solution to restore some movement options to a foot that has a bunion. So that is a very simple way of describing it. I hope that made sense. We're going to have a bit of a discussion after this session, so if there's anything that we need to clarify, we can do that. But I think it's nice to see that happening on a foot model where you can actually see the bones, so that when we go up and try to explore this in our own bodies, we have a little bit of a conceptual reference point. So I'm going to put this guy away now. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the connections that our feet have with our skulls. We're going to look at the movement of the big toes. What can we do? What can't we do? And how that's related to, like I said, the skull and also other areas of the body. And then we're going to do some explorations of some movements to give our bodies back whatever it can get for some new input to help the big toe to do something a little bit different. It's not to say that we can definitely change the structure of your foot, change the shape of it, but we can absolutely give it back some new movement options to help it have a little bit different of an experience, whether or not the structure actually changes. That's the most important thing, is that the foot has some dynamic capabilities again, whether or not the actual static position changes. And you'll